Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on BCTV and Emily's YouTube channel. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I have with me regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who is one of 3 representatives to the state from the town of Brattleboro. Hey, Emily.
Good morning, Olga.
And I have to say our award for Series of the Year from Brattleboro Community Television looks very nice over your shoulder.
Thank you. I've really been working on my background.
It's meant to be there. It is, definitely. And I also want to welcome back to the show because we have talked to Josh Davis, who is the Executive Director of the Groundworks Collaborative, on more than one occasion about housing, and it's really nice to have you back. How are you, Josh?
I'm well this morning, Olga. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Always good to see you. And new to the show, very excited, is Skye Morse, who is a principal and investment developer, investment
director
at M&S. Yep. Director. Okay. I knew I should have written that one down before I started talking. With M&S development. And for folks who don't know, Skye, what does your focus entail at the development level?
Yeah, so broadly, M&S was founded in the wake of the Brooks House fire and the community effort to bring that building back from the brink. And all of the learnings and the experience that went into and came out of that process, it was realized that there are other towns that may not have experienced a catastrophic fire like Brattleboro did, but maybe have been experiencing a slow fire over the last 30 or 40 years. And as a result, these towns are in desperate need of assistance. And the Brooks House used many funding sources and complex structuring in order to make a project of that scale happen in a rural community, small rural community like this. And our aim is to bring that knowledge and experience to other communities.
Wonderful. Well, Emily and I are glad that both of you are here today, because one of the things we want to talk about is housing, especially housing post COVID-19 emergency funding from the federal government, which, unless something changes, is due to end at the end of this month. And Josh, remind us, early in the pandemic, the state of Vermont worked really hard to make sure if someone was homeless, that they had some kind of long-term shelter. So they were not dealing with the pandemic without housing. Tell us kind of what happened there.
Sure. Very early on, I guess a week or 2 into March, the state decided that they were going to open up the motels. And it started first with focusing on hyper vulnerable individuals, but very quickly expanded to include everybody that was experiencing homelessness, to move them out of shelters, which a lot of our shelter system, especially the overflow, the winter shelters, are congregate sites. So I wanted to get people out of that type of environment and into a facility that had their own room, that they could shut the door, and own bathroom, very much trying to make sure that everybody's health is taken care of as much as possible. And I have to give a big shout out, Emily and legislators and housing advocates for being at the forefront of this. I think that this is a relatively unique way in which we're working and supporting people experiencing homelessness. If you look across the country, there are other communities that have done that, but I think Vermont so quickly responded and opened up the Motel Program and prioritized getting shelter and making sure that not only folks experiencing homelessness are safe, but really it helps the rest of our community be safer because of it. So it really innovative, and kudos to Emily and the legislative team for doing that.
So a few other sort of like setting the ground, and thank you, Josh. Thank you for actually doing all the work to make it happen rather than just making a decision about it. A a few other sort of ground setting things. We also put in place an eviction moratorium that lasts beyond the federal eviction moratorium. So that is set to go 30 days. There's like some extra guidelines in there, but essentially 30 days past the end of the state of emergency. And then put in place a bunch of federal funding that helps folks who are behind on their rent or behind on their mortgage to receive grant funds to catch up during this time. So that the eviction moratorium won't, the idea is that we want people to still be paying rent or their mortgages during the eviction moratorium so that we don't have this terrible cascade effect when it ends. So those are sort of the ground of this conversation. And then those federal grant funds are set to expire on January 1st. The Motel Program was in place before we received federal funds. And so there's some questions about what moving forward is on that. And then the other question sort of moving forward is, we had a housing crisis before the pandemic. We have a housing shortage at essentially every single layer of the market, except for sort of very high value homes. And then, all just like everything else, further exacerbated by the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's quickly check in with you, Josh, about what Emily said about the Motel Program. Do you have any insight or ways forward on that program?
Yeah, the latest guidance that we're getting, and I think it's interesting to reflect that the Motel Program, the decision to open that up came prior to CRF being finalized. And so it was really a leap of faith that we were going to be able to pay for that backfill once some relief funds came in. And so what we're getting right now is that the motel-based services and that Motel Program is going to continue into the new year, although the source of funding is shifting from CRF funds. Like Emily said, that we're on the precipice of those expiring. We have a couple projects that are funded by CRF funds that we're rapidly trying to wrap up that I'm sure we're going to touch base on in this show. And we're going to switch to FEMA funds. And so those funds are a little bit different, and we're going through the process now with our primary contacts through Agency of Human Services, which is Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO. And Sarah Phillips and the crew at OEO has been fantastic working with shelters and organizations such as Groundworks throughout this entire pandemic. So just want to give them a shout out. And in that switch, we don't have clear guidance. I guess the aim is to get the next 6 months through FEMA, but it's unclear to me if we're actually going to make it until the end of June with this funding source. So internally, we're prepared to make it January, February, and March, which would really get us out of the harsh weather months. And then beyond that, there's just so much uncertainty. There's so many unknowns that we're not banking on that being a sustained source through June.
Mm-hmm.
It would be lovely if it is, but I know already we're getting kind of mixed signals from the folks that do have their hand on the purse strings that, oh, we got to shut it down in January. Wait, we found this other source. Okay, we're going to go in through the end of June, but maybe we're not sure exactly that if it's going to get us there. And I think that has been kind of the modus operandi through this pandemic. There's just been so much uncertainty that we have to be as flexible as possible.
And so much of that is that we're getting this uncertainty at the federal level. Is there going to be an aid package before January? What will the first 100 days of executive action look like? Don't want to commit state funds if there's the promise of federal funds available.
Mm-hmm.
So the other layer of this, and I talked to Maura Collins on the phone yesterday from VHFA, who was on the show, I think maybe even twice, maybe just
Yeah,
once.
she's been on twice. I think
Okay.
The last time was either October or September.
Just if any listeners want to go back in the archives. And one thing that we reflected on, and I think Josh, we've talked about this, is that we had this hope. There was this period of hope in, say, April,
Mm-hmm.
where we really felt like everyone finally understands the need for more housing.
Right.
We are going to solve this problem before the pandemic ends.
Well, and I would add that it was also for me a hope that it showed how we could solve other problems, and that this COVID could actually be this source of creativity and inspiration and new problem solving.
So we do have this one project at Daylem Chalet, which is
35 units.
35 units. We have
190 people in motels in the Brattleboro area.
I've been seeing on the social media that we have a lot of people who are moving here right now, who are just, looking for market rate rentals and not able to find them. And so
it's a good segue for Skye.
Skye. What do you think about all this?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see all of the work that's going into the homelessness support system, and how when given some new resources and a crunch, because let's not forget that this large stimulus had to all be spent literally out the door and spent on contractors and so forth by the end of this year, how the machine just whipped into action and found solutions and got stuff done. It's really impressive. And I think we're fortunate to be in such a small state where so many people know each other within the housing community. I myself am relatively new to the housing support, housing creation community, and the degree of integration is really impressive, and how everyone works to support one another. And so this state was able to pull together and support our people in greatest need. What I was focused on before this was folks in the tier kind of just above homelessness, but not yet able to access the market rate units that may be available. Now, as Emily alluded earlier, we have a very low vacancy rate here in Windham County. And what that means is there's not a lot of housing supply, not a lot of units available. And with the pandemic, with new people moving here, often with means to snap up those market rate units, it further exacerbates the lack of supply. And so the thing that I'm chiefly focused on these days is called the 4% low-income housing tax credit. And this is really technical, and so I'm not going to get into it too much. But
you're welcome to get in it as far as you want.
We love geek.
Okay.
We have no idea if anyone's ever listening, so just make it interesting for the people in the room.
All
right. Okay. So let me just. Okay, so affordable housing is something that most folks are familiar with. Sometimes people say they refer to Section 8. That is or was one program where people get vouchers, and that allows them to pay rents in just ordinary apartments. Another program is the low-income housing tax credit program, and that subsidizes the creation of new housing. And then there are rent limits placed on that new housing. And there are actually two different programs for low-income housing tax credits. One is the 9% program, and that 9% is a total misnomer or not a misnomer, it's a red herring. It doesn't really mean anything in practical terms, but you get 70% of your construction costs. So it's a really deep discount. It's a deep subsidy and allows us to create housing for those folks who need the deepest subsidy in their rent. And then there's another program called the 4% housing tax credit. And again, the 4% is a red herring. Don't pay attention to it. It gives you 30% of your construction costs, which is great. That's a great subsidy, but it does mean that you still have to go and use debt and equity like you would if, let's say, you were going to build your own house and you go to the bank and you get a construction loan and they want to see that you've got 20% down in equity or something like that, and then they'll loan you the rest. And so in Vermont, we don't really use the 4% tax credits. And each year, these are VHFA numbers, each year we give back to the federal government something like the equivalent of $32 million.
Oh, that's just silly.
Just imagine how much housing could be created every year with that $32 million. And the reason that we don't use it is because, yes, it gives us a 30% discount on our construction costs, but you still have to borrow the rest. And you have to then, take a mortgage, borrow that, and you have to make payments on it. And the rents, which are based on income that are set by HUD, are too low to afford the mortgage payment.
Okay.
So we can't use it.
Sorry, Skye.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say
so
this.
It's an issue that begs to be solved, because this is a massive resource for such a small state and could do so much good. And so we have been working for the last 2 years at M&S Development to try to crack this puzzle, solve this puzzle on how do we use that? How do we bring some other funding sources in or structure things differently so that we can use that $32 million to create housing in our rural communities?
And thank you for that, because, whenever I talk to people in housing, and it really doesn't matter what type of housing they're trying to create, unless they're in the really up market, this is the upside down between rents and construction costs is like a barrier. It seems everyone is hitting. And I'm curious with Emily and Josh, if there are other places in the system that you say, here are the levers we also need to pull so that we can solve that problem.
Well, what I think is interesting is I often see people having conversations, or I'm part of conversations about how we shouldn't be building any publicly supported or tax incentivized or anything like that housing that isn't sort of perpetually affordable. Even if, when there's conversations about mixed units, I think this came up a lot with the museum project. And I don't know if this would be true in, say, New York City or somewhere with a much more dynamic market, but from my perspective, anywhere that we can create any space or leverage in the market whatsoever, even with new homes, like single family homes, we are creating so much more space in sort of that, what, people call the missing middle, even though I find that to be an incredibly awkward phrase. It's better than workforce housing, which is terrible. We're creating space so that people who can maybe pay market rate rents, but low market rate rents might be able to find a place. We make space so that people who have affordable housing vouchers might have a snowball's chance in actually finding a place, because we have dozens and dozens of people in motels right now with vouchers that can't even find a place to use their vouchers. So, and then the second part is, we know from decades of studies that mixed income housing is healthiest for the people who live there, for the communities that they're in, and for the children that are growing up in them. We know that's good for education outcomes. We know that's good for social outcomes. We know that's good for cohesion and community participation. Like, it is best practice to have mixed income housing. But when we're in this deep scarcity environment where we all feel like we need housing at every level, mixed income housing feels like no one's getting enough of what they need. And so I think people react to that. And I felt that way, when we were talking about building more permanent housing for the folks in motels. I remember being like super mad that we couldn't just like build, 100 units in one spot for all of the folks who are in motels to live together. I remember ranting and raving with Josh about this. And I know, like, because it's an emergency and there's scarcity, but long term, I know it's best for communities and for the families and individuals living there to be in a mixed income environment.
Yes, yes. I mean, if you look at naturally occurring communities, which is what we are fortunate enough to live in, is you drive down Sweet Pond Road where I live, there are all sorts of homes. It is not that all people of one socioeconomic demographic live in one section and others live in other sections. Now, in artificially created communities, you find that. And then you find a growing divide between those two groups that you've now created artificially, and a lack of social cohesion. And I completely agree with you, Emily, that the best solution is a fully mixed income solution. Actually, that's what was achieved at the Brooks House. There are some very high-end units and there are some subsidized units, some low-income housing units. They're all built exactly the same. Walking into one or the other, you would never know if there is a rent subsidy. But you have a normally distributed socioeconomic community, which is really crucial.
I can't, I know it's a bit of a diversion, but I just want to name that we don't have any naturally occurring communities in Vermont because of redlining, and that we know that there were people who could not get mortgages that might have gotten mortgages otherwise, but it is more naturally occurring than most communities and in the country. I guess
what I was getting at, is if you travel to much of the country, you'll see enormous housing developments.
Absolutely.
That were, hundreds of homes that were built by one developer, cookie cutter style, and then just down the road, there's another one. And this community has rents or prices set at this level, and this community has rents set this level, and they're very different.
Absolutely.
And that's not how Brattleboro and most towns in Vermont have occurred over the years.
Agreed.
Josh, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here listening. I think, what we're talking about is we have folks that are in the motels that are the canary in the coal mine that are showing us that we are in the midst of a housing crisis, really demonstrating that. We need to add new units. We need to add new housing opportunities, not just for the folks that are experiencing homelessness, but throughout our community. And it seems like besides the work that M&S has done at Brooks House, really the most active developer in our community is the Housing Trust. And so when we are adding units, we're adding units for folks that are at the lower end of socioeconomic. And you started to speak to this about trying to tap in and use the 4% Skye, but I think just underscoring the challenges of adding any sort of housing outside of the 9%. And I don't know if that's a policy. Are there policy levers there that can deal with the challenges of adding units outside of what the work that the Housing Trust does here in Windham County? But there's also, housing trusts in other communities throughout Vermont that are the same.
We have just about 5 minutes before we need to go to break. So I just want to touch in and make sure, Emily, Skye, or Josh, if you have any thoughts you want to leave listeners with before we go to break.
There's, I guess, further to Josh's point, as we, and further underlining the issue that we're facing and trying to solve, if you look at the large-scale housing creation in Brattleboro and Windham County in general over the last 20 or 30 years, we see that on Black Mountain Road, John Brunel has built Black Mountain Estates. And that is, I would say, by any rural measure, a large-scale housing development. And he is an extremely experienced developer and has done a great job pulling that off with much pain. If we go back in time, there's nothing like that until you get back to, I think, Arborgate or Morningside, built in the 90s. So we're looking at 20 or 30 years of massive economic boom nationally and no meaningful housing creation in this area. And that is a symptom. That is the playing out of this missing middle, I think you called it, where it costs just as much to build here as it does outside of Boston or outside of Atlanta or outside of Houston, right? But we don't have the skilled labor. So the availability of skilled labor. So our construction costs are relatively higher and our rents are meaningfully lower. And so we have that upside down ratio of cost to value and cost to rent. And so it just doesn't pencil out for private developers to build housing.
There's also something in sort of the bucolic story that we share and perpetuate here, and that brings new folks here that for the most part, when new people move to the area with sort of middle and higher incomes, they are willing and interested in buying a 300-year-old farmhouse that needs another $200,000 worth of work rather than something that like is actually livable. And so I think in some ways that also creates a disincentive for even sort of newer middle income housing, because people tend to buy the cute thing rather than the functional, heatable thing. And I think that is changing with more conversations about green economy and green energy and, better energy audits happening on new purchases. But I wonder how much of that is sort of part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have to go to break. I think one thing I will add right before we head off is, it's interesting for me, having grown up in the Deerfield Valley, that there has been a lot of mini housing booms in the Deerfield Valley, but a lot of them have happened around Mount Snow or Haystack or Stratton as second homes, and some of them become full-time homes, but the initial intention behind most of them have been as second homes. And I just find that as an interesting, difference between communities. The Montpelier Happy Hour will be back on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining us, I'm speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser, Skye Morse, and Josh Davis, and we are talking about housing shortages in Vermont. Hey, Emily, what do we need to remind listeners about?
Oh, well, the views and opinions expressed on this show are those of the hosts and the guests, and not the radio station or the TV station.
Why, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Skye, let's jump to you. M&S Development is doing a project on Flat Street. Most people in Brattleboro might know it as the Snell Building. Excuse me, tell us what's happening there.
Yeah. So this project is the culmination, really, of the last 2 years of work. And I mentioned this earlier, that there's this 4% tax credit resource that is underutilized in Vermont. And the governor challenged the housing community to find a way to use these dollars. And so we are responding to that challenge with this relatively bite-sized project. It
Guy,
would
can
create.
I ask, what is a challenge from the governor? Did he just say, "I issue you a challenge," or was it?
It just kind of he threw down a gauntlet on the ground and he said, "Go forth and create housing."
Oh.
Okay, cool.
That's a mind image.
Continue.
Yes.
Yes.
And so I received outreach from VHFA. Seth Leonard has been a phenomenal teacher for me as a new entrant into this world. And we've worked with a number of other agencies and organizations throughout the state in coming up with this new model for affordable housing to utilize these tax credits. And so the Snell Building is our guinea pig. It'll create 19 net new housing units. So currently the building sits vacant, and it has for over a decade. And we are going to have a co-working space on the ground floor. Brattleboro ordinance requires you have some sort of commercial space. And so we're going to have a fully programmed, high quality co-working space on the ground floor. And then, 19 mixed income affordable units. And so this is for folks in that missing middle. So making between $20,000 and $40,000 a year. That's, a lot of folks who work on Main Street in the restaurants and shops, and these are going to be really nice units, thanks to the Community Development Block Grant Program run by VCDP. Vermont State Housing Authority has pledged 9 vouchers, project-based vouchers, and Wyndham Regional has helped us with Brownsfield funding. We have to make sure that there's no contamination in the building and the surrounding area. Peter Johnson, the property owner, has worked with us to get to a workable acquisition price and some flexible terms, where he's taking a little bit of risk as well to make this happen. So there's, and of course, VHFA with the tax credits and the debt. And when we're hoping to have VITA bring in debt to support the co-working space. So it is truly a multi-layered, multi-party project that takes this whole housing funding community working together to make this happen.
Can you explain how funding something with tax credits works?
Yeah, I can.
People talk about it a lot, but
they do.
I didn't know what it meant until last year. So
yeah. Oh, I also want to mention the Vermont Downtown Program, the Downtown and Village Center tax credit program. So there's state tax credits in here as well. So
also, Skye, if I could ask you a question too, if you could talk about using tax credits, but also the timeline of pulling something like this together, because I think that's really important in the context that we're talking about.
Yeah, so we're going on 2 years. We're actually beyond the 2-year mark of developing this. And so that's myself and my team spending our time with no money coming in the door, right? No one's paying me to do this.
And that's not even, that's putting together a financing package. That's not even talking about permitting for construction.
It's the whole, it's the whole development, which includes, figuring out how to pay for it. Well, first, figuring out what it's going to cost, the acquisition, the environmental contamination remediation, we've got to hire architects, and just the design work could take 6 to 9 months, and someone's got to pay them along the way. So there's a lot of risk taken by these private developers, us in this case, with no certainty that it's actually going to come to fruition. And we're really dependent on these competitive funding programs like Community Development Block Grant, for which we were just awarded $492,000 last month. So that was a big piece of the puzzle. Also, the state historic tax credits. It's making sure that we get each of these things to drop into the funding stack is crucial to success. If one of them doesn't come through, we fail. And so, there's a lot of risk. But to your question on tax credits, so the federal government has said we want more affordable housing, and we will give tax credits to someone who builds affordable units. And so we can't use those tax credits. We don't make enough money. I don't really make any money. And you need tax liability. You have to have some taxes that you're supposed to pay that you use the tax credits to offset. So we go to a large investor or a bank, someone like US Bank or People's Bank. In this case, Brattleboro Savings and Loan is going to take some of the tax credits. And they have to pay their federal income tax just like everybody else. And by investing in our project, they get tax credits in return. So if you think about, let's say someone put in $9,000 for the promise of getting $10,000 in tax credits. And the great thing about that is it's effectively free money to the project. It means that the project gets the $10,000 and doesn't have to pay it back ever. And the investor invests the $10,000 or invest the $9,000, and they get the tax credits in return as their repayment. So it's the federal government saying, well, we can't give you money, but we know someone who can, and we'll give them a tax break if they do. Mm-hmm. So it's this creative way to get private, profitable corporations to invest in our communities, which is pretty creative.
And I think it's interesting and important to differentiate that if we think about federal tax credits, and depending on your views of how the Fed works and how taxes work at a federal level, essentially that is also free money. Whereas when we talk about tax credits on the state level, that is, those are much closer to real dollars that are either removed or added.
Right. I mean, if we want to really get into tax policy, there's no such thing as free money.
Right.
Because if US Bank doesn't pay their taxes, that means we have to pay more to fund the services.
At a state level, but not necessarily on a federal level. So that's the debatable part, but there is definitely a big difference between what it means at the federal level and the state level.
Yeah. So Josh,
I can hear all my listeners, especially the ones probably above the age of 55, who are now screaming at the radio saying, there is no such thing as free money and it does not grow on trees. And how dare you?
It is a real disservice. I think it's a real disservice to democracy that whenever economists talk about this stuff, they like constantly use metaphors regarding people's own bank accounts and like personal home ledgers, when in fact, microeconomics and macroeconomics are two different fields for a reason. But sometimes I worry that being on Ways and Means, we're going to like lose all of our listenership because I'm just going to get more and more boring as time goes on. But we will bear with it, and maybe Josh has something to say.
No, I just love the fact that there's low-income housing tax credits, there's historic tax credits, there's new market tax credits. Groundworks was a beneficiary of a new market tax credit investment on our building on 60 South Main. And so it's not just the low-income housing tax credit that we're able to use for development if we want to go full wonk. And I look forward to that day, Emily, when you're coming back from Ways and Means, really getting into the weeds. But just to transition a little bit, I do want to just underscore where we started this conversation to say, you know, with the Chalet Project, that is a development that we've been able to bring online. The Housing Trust has really worked tirelessly to bring this project online under the deadline and the window of the CRF funds expiring. That's a net add of 35 units. And there are already folks that were using that space as longer term, kind of month to month housing that will remain there, which is fantastic that we can provide a bit more stability and bring some dollars in to renovate the space. But what it means is, with the goal of trying to add more units to the community, it's a less than a net add of the 35 units that are there. So the fact that we still have over 180 people in the motels, and we have 3 months, 6 months, maybe until this funding for the Motel Program expires, begs the question as we enter the legislative session. As a legislator, this must be top of mind with all the other things that you're going to be facing, Emily. And so just thinking about or asking you, you know, what's your mindset going into this session for this particular issue, because we're not unique in Windham County.
We are not unique in Windham County, but because the face of homelessness in Brattleboro is much more public than I think in a lot of places before the pandemic. I think in some ways, my colleagues often think of this as sort of a Brattleboro Burlington problem and not a statewide problem. And so put a lot of attention on sort of rehabbing existing units without realizing the full scale of the challenge we're facing as a complete state. As I go into the session, I continue to feel incredibly clear that we need to keep people in motels. I know that we've had seen a lot of great health outcomes coming from people who are staying in the motels. It's been an opportunity to really prove a point that I think low-income advocates have been making for a very long time about how it is both more humane and dignified and, you know, good to have people with housing, but it's also cheaper long-term to have people in housing. And so I'm going to continue to beat that drum in terms of what we need to do to really prioritize the spending to keep people in motels until we can find more housing, but also knowing how long development takes, that we need medium-term stuff like the chalet, dollars to just convert units tomorrow. And we need to continue to invest in these longer-term projects like the Snell Building and sort of the missing middle stuff to really solve this problem here. And so I'm going to keep on doing that. Some of that is making sure that VHCB gets a larger share of their notwithstanding, which is
what is that?
So long ago in statute, someone brilliantly, long before me, said we have a housing problem. We have a housing problem that gets worse often when we have more houses sold and when we have more houses purchased, right? So that's something that we've talked about a lot in Windham County. You know, second homes rush in, prices go up. And so some of the money when a home is sold goes into this fund. All of that money is supposed to go to VHCB. There's this weird thing in statute called notwithstanding, and basically you can say like any law that you passed in the past. That's very hard to enunciate. You've just decided you're not going to pay attention to this biennium, and you notwithstand it. It's more complicated than I'm explaining it. So what we keep on doing is saying, like, we know that VHCB is supposed to get all of this money, but instead we're going to dump 3/4 of it into the general fund and only give 1/4 of it to VHCB. So there's already a lot of really good mechanisms to get more money to VHCB. I'm going to push for that. I'm going to push for greater emphasis on how we tax really high value homes. And second homes. The way we organize our property taxes makes it really hard to sort of have good policy with regards to that. Sort of rental properties and commercial properties are in the same category, and that's sort of confusing. Second homes and camps are in the same. There's a lot of strange stuff there. So want to work on that. And then, you know, hopefully move the treasurer along with regards to a new bond, which we know had a really big impact last time around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you,
Emily. I'd love to bend your ear on a couple of these things, because having now been, you know, really deep into the housing theory from the developer standpoint, I have a new appreciation for all of these programs and a lot of ideas about how we could leverage the existing programs for greater impact, and any additional new funding, you know, we could ensure that it is maximized as well. From Absolutely. You know, from my perspective, I'm not saying that I necessarily have the answers, but based on what we're running into, you know, what would make things better.
And I've been really, really excited how in Brattleboro, we finally had folks like you, Skye, really come together with folks who are working on affordable housing, or just folks who don't have housing, like to really see the economic development and the housing development conversation really come together with the human services community. That's been a really exciting thing over the last year. And I believe that Josh sort of kickstarted that conversation long ago about a failed grant, right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, you know, going back, Emily, to what you were saying, like housing is the thing. And I know I'm biased, but it's the lodestar. It is it's a central piece to providing stability to the community. Skye, do you see the 4% tax credits as the biggest opportunity right now to add more housing to this community quickly?
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. There are two things that are not HUD mandated, but are state of Vermont mandated, that I think are constraining our ability to fully utilize this. And I'm going to say two things that are perhaps controversial.
Go for it.
Just two.
Yeah, for this conversation. So the first has to do with the homelessness set aside. Peter Shumlin, as governor, signed an executive order mandating that all affordable housing created in the state of Vermont with public funding, permanently affordable housing, be include a 15% homeless set aside. That is 15% of the units be set aside for individuals and families experiencing homelessness. And that puts a lot of pressure on someone like me trying to develop affordable housing with the 4% credit, because the 4% credit means I need to carry debt. I need to go to the bank and borrow a bunch of money for the rest of it. And in order to do that, I need to charge rent on all my units. And they're affordable rents, but we do need rent out of every single unit. I should also say that in this new model, this funding model that we've developed, our goal is not to touch any of the traditional housing sources. There are state affordable housing tax credits. We don't want to touch those. There's federal home money and affordable housing trust fund money, not touching all of the VHCB funding effectively. We don't want to touch that because we don't want to take away from the pie that is already split up into so many slices amongst the affordable housing groups around the state. We want to create a new method and truly make the pie bigger. And one of the things that does constrain us is the homelessness set aside, because sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Question though on that set aside, to make sure that I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that just questioning the onus of responsibility being on the developer? Like that responsibility?
Or is it actually the units being used?
It's the source of funding. So we've been fortunate in the Snell Building that we were able to secure vouchers from the Vermont State Housing Authority. And so they will cover the rent effectively for anyone who qualifies for these units. So if you have no income, the state will pay the full rent. However, if you have a lower income, but some income, the state will cover the difference. And our hope is that we really focus on that missing middle. There's so many people who want good, safe, high quality housing that if we were just to build 4% projects for people in that $20,000 to $40,000 range, we could easily fill our developments. There are people out there who need the housing. And there are also phenomenal projects like Dalem and Great River Terrace that are really serving the homeless population well. They're designed for those folks with those needs in mind. So that's my controversial statement number one. I'll stop talking now for a second.
And we have just over 5 minutes. So
you get to just say your next controversial opinion, I think. And
yeah,
I won't argue with you. I think that's what you're.
All right. The next one is about permanent affordability. The federal program mandates 30 years, which seems like permanent, from one person's lifetime, but from a building's lifetime, it's just the beginning. And putting a permanent restriction on it, it really restricts what that building can become and how it can be redeveloped and what funding sources you can use in the next 30 years. It basically mandates that you have to come back to the affordable housing well of money. Whereas if it's not mandated, that could then become just market rate housing, which, as we spoke about in the beginning, we don't really have any new high quality market rate housing.
So would you propose like a 15-year mandate?
30 is fine, 30? just not permanent. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 30 comes from HUD. So if I use the 4% LIHTC, HUD says it has to be affordable for 30 years. Vermont says if you take any other funding from the state of Vermont, it's forever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, forever is a long time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, as always, whenever I have Josh on the show, definitely. And we're talking about housing. And of course, now with you, Skye, we only have scraped the top of the iceberg. But as always, we appreciate you being here. Quickly, Josh, before we go, I would love if you could add what you would like to see change in the system.
What I would like to see changed in the system. I don't know, it's hard not to be extremely grateful when I'm with you now, with the emphasis that's gone into the Motel Program, with the emphasis that's gone into the Chalet Project, with the amount of resources that we have available for people to get them out of the motel. You know, it's really about how do we rapidly increase the housing stock. And I think that, again, front of mind, we have, we're on the, I'm not going to pop the champagne in this call now, but the Chalet is rapidly wrapping up. I mean, they're coming skidding across the finish line. It's amazing. I was just out there this morning. But we're about to pop the champagne on that. What other opportunities do we have in the community in the short term? And I'm really focused on the next 3 to 6 months. I would love to have a repeat of the Chalet, if at all possible. I think that it really is needed, given the number of folks that are in the motels right now. We have been able to take care and support people getting back into housing using some of the CARES subsidies, so subsidies that are supporting people's housing specifically because of the CARES Act. But that's more of a slow trickle than it is really taking a big chunk out of the need that we're experiencing right now. And so on the one hand, really want to continue to push this conversation and say, yes, we should celebrate the Chalet, but our work is not done. And on the other hand, extremely grateful that we're prioritizing this as a community, that we have these opportunities as a community because our leadership locally, but also leadership at the state that are prioritizing people's housing need.
Thank you. Well, as we head out, Emily and I always toast at the end of the show. So I want to toast to leaps of faith, because I think in so many ways, in all the conversations we've been having around COVID, that's kind of what it takes sometimes to just get the final solution over the finish line. Is we have to trust and take that leap of faith and not just believe in scarcity. So cheers, everyone.
Yeah.
Cheers. I want some hot chocolate now, Olga.
Mm-hmm. So, Emily, where can people find you if they have questions?
Folks can find me at emilykornheiser.org, where you can find links to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, email, phone number, and my weekly community conversations via Zoom every Saturday at 10 a.m.
Josh Davis, if people need services or they want to learn more about Groundworks Collaborative.
Hop on our website, groundworksvt.org. That's the best place to get started. But feel free to email or call. We love to talk about the work that we do.
And Skye, either how can people find more about M&S development, or if there are other housing resources you think they should check out?
Yeah, well, we're on the web at mnsdevelopmentllc.com. You can find my bio and contact info there. And we are always looking for new opportunities. We'll work throughout the state, throughout New England, doing innovative projects in these high value and high need communities.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Skye. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. We'll return next week. Take care.